Good morning, distinguished guests, students, and teachers. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to Meet Professor Kishore, a dialogue with young students in Hong Kong, hosted by the Yu Chong Yua Education Network and the Hong Kong Policy Research Institute. I am Matthew Chung.
And I am Hoi Kyu Chan, both Year 12 students at YCIS Hong Kong, and we are honored to be your MCs for today's talk. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Professor Paul Yip, Dr. Betty Chan, Mr. Chan Hung Wing, and Mr. Paul Te to today's dialogue. We are also happy to see students, teachers, and our principals from the YCIS Hong Kong campus, as well as other secondary schools, universities, and people joining us in the Yu Chong Yua School Network from the mainland joining us online. I'm sure you're all as excited as we are, eagerly anticipating the opportunity to be part of this sharing session live with a prominent figure in the global political arena.
To kickstart our event, I would like to invite Mr. Martin Scott, Education Director and Executive Principal of YCIS Hong Kong, to deliver an opening address. Mr. Scott, please.
Zhashang Ha. Good morning, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, students, and our students and colleagues from the mainland who are joining us online. It's with great pleasure and honor that I stand before you today to introduce a man of exceptional wisdom, insight, and global renown, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. As a highly respected diplomat, academic, and author, Professor Mahbubani has dedicated his life in the pursuit of understanding the complex intricacies of international relations and the promotion of dialogue between nations. Throughout his illustrious career, he has championed the belief that a prosperous and peaceful future for humanity is only possible through the mutual understanding, cooperation, and collaboration between East and West. Professor Mahbubani's academic achievements are both impressive and extensive. He holds a master's degree in philosophy from Dalhousie University, Canada, and a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He has also been awarded numerous honorary doctorates, both in recognition of his academic prowess and his significant contribution to the field of international relations. During his 33-year career in the Singapore Foreign Service, Professor Mahbubani held several key positions, including serving as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and as president of the United Nations Security Council. His deep understanding of diplomacy and international affairs has been invaluable in shaping Singapore's foreign policy and navigating the ever-changing landscape of global politics. In addition to his diplomatic career, Professor Mahbubani is a prolific writer and a thought leader, with numerous articles, op-eds, and books to his name. Some of his most notable works include Can Asians Think?, The New Asian Hemisphere, The Great Convergence, and his latest masterpiece, Has China Won? His writings offer a unique perspective on the evolving role of Asia in global affairs, challenging conventional wisdom and proposing innovative solutions to the challenges of our time. As the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore for more than a decade, Professor Mahbubani has played a pivotal role in shaping the minds of future leaders, fostering intellectual curiosity, and promoting a spirit of inquiry and rigorous debate. Today, we are incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from his vast reservoir of knowledge experience, and wisdom. As we listen to his words, let us be inspired to seek a deeper understanding of the world around us, to engage in thoughtful discourse, and to work together in pursuit of a more harmonious and prosperous global community. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our esteemed Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who I will now invite to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. That was an excessively generous introduction. So I want you to all lower your expectations. I really appreciate that, Martin, that very generous introduction. You're very, very kind, and I appreciate that very much. I also want to begin by thanking Professor Paul Yip and Mrs. Betty Chan for once again hosting me so warmly. It's been such a pleasure for me and my wife to be here, and we appreciate all the warm welcome we have received here in Hong Kong. I also want to thank my good friend, Ambassador Chan Ing-weng, and Mrs. Chan for, Eileen, for arranging all this wonderful stay in Hong Kong. Now, I believe that the most useful thing I can do for all of you, especially the young people in this room, is to try and give you a glimpse of what are the big challenges that your generation will probably face. When 20 years from now, you'll all be working adults, you'll be having jobs, you'll be traveling the world, you'll be trying to cope with the great changes in the world. So it'd be good for you to have a sense of what are the great challenges that are coming your way 20 years from now. And I'm reasonably confident that the challenges that I predict will come your way. And to help you remember this, and I want you to remember this speech 20 years from now, okay? On 26th April 2043, 2043, please remember the 3 Gs. The 3 Gs, the challenges that will come your way are, number 1, geopolitics. Number 2, global governance. And number 3, good governance. And I'll explain what I see as the differences between global governance and good governance. So let me begin with the first G. Geopolitics. I may say a little bit less here since, thanks to Professor Paul Yip, I gave a lecture yesterday at Shangri-La Hotel, which I believe you can find on YouTube on geopolitics. But what I can tell you is that certainly over the next 10 years, you will see the biggest geopolitical contest ever since human history began, because it'll be between 2 incredibly powerful great powers, namely the United States of America and China. Now, as Martin mentioned, I've written a book called Has China Won? That talks about why this struggle is inevitable. And as I said yesterday, it's inevitable because it's driven by deep structural forces. And I'll briefly mention them. The first one, of course, is the fact that there is an iron law of geopolitics, which says that whenever the world's #1 emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's #1 power, which today is the United States of America, the world's #1 power always, always pushes down the world's #1 emerging power. You know, geopolitics, I should emphasize to you all, is a very cruel business. It's all about power. And from the point of view of the number one power, the United States of America, there's a huge difference between being number one and being number two. Huge difference. And so the United States, perhaps in what you might call a rational action by the world's number one power, is ensuring that it will not lose its number one position. And so that's why the United States has carried out various acts to, in one way or another, trip up China. You know that Donald Trump launched a trade war against China in 2018. And what's interesting is that when Joe Biden, the current president, was running for the presidential election in 2019, he actually said, it's a matter of record, you can find it on my website, he said as a matter of record, these tariffs that Donald Trump has imposed on China will not hurt China at all. They will hurt American workers, American consumers, and the American people, right? And Joe Biden was right. These tariffs have not hurt China. They've hurt the American people. Now, Joe Biden has been president for over 2 years. Has he been able to withdraw the tariffs that he imposed? No. He can't. His hands are tied. He cannot appear to be soft on China. So the tariffs, which are hurting American workers, continue. I say this to you so you understand the deeper forces that are driving this contest between the United States and China. And more recently, as you know, the Biden administration has launched something called the CHIPS Act to deny China access to the most advanced chips, to the most advanced chip-making technology. And why is the United States doing that? It's because it wants to stay ahead of China. Now, of course, the Biden administration denies that it is trying to stop China. And you saw recently, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it, a speech that was made a few days ago by the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. And it's actually a very good speech. It's a very thoughtful speech. And she is by far one of the most moderate members of the Biden cabinet. And in the speech, she says that the United States is not trying to stop the rise of China. But frankly, people know that that's not true. And even today, this morning when I woke up, I was reading a column in the Financial Times by one of, I think one of the leading economics columnists in the world. His name is Martin Wolf. And he has just been to China. Actually, he was in China for the China Development Forum meeting a few weeks ago. And he said, and this is his, I think his opening paragraph. He says, we are entering a very dangerous world. And why are we entering a very dangerous world? Because the competition between the United States and China is going to step up. So for someone sensible, sober, who doesn't get alarmist like Martin Wolf to say we are entering a very dangerous world provides direct confirmation of my key point that the geopolitical struggle between the United States and China will accelerate. And if the first structural force driving it is the iron law of geopolitics, a second structural force which I speak about in my book is what I call the fear of the yellow peril. Now, the fear of the yellow peril is something that nobody talks about except me. And because it's politically incorrect, in case you're wondering what the yellow peril is, This is something that has existed in the Western imagination since the days when the Mongols almost conquered Europe 800 years ago. But it's there, the fear is real, and if you want a small fact of history which is very important for you to know, the United States Congress passed an act called the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act in the 1890s, 130 years ago. And that passing of that act demonstrated the real fear that Americans have of the yellow peril. That emotional dimension is also a factor. And of course, as you know, the third structural force is the ideological dimension, and that's been very well described by President Joe Biden when he said, what we are seeing today is a struggle within democracies and autocracies, with the United States representing democracies and China representing autocracies. So I'm telling you all this so you understand that there are deeper forces driving this contest. It will accelerate, and it will, I guarantee you this, no matter what you do, no matter where you are, this geopolitical struggle will disrupt your lives in one way or another, right? So get ready psychologically for it, and keep watching it because you know it will affect your lives. So let me turn now to the second G, global governance. Now, one thing I've learned, I've been ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, and I find the best way to put an audience to sleep is to bring out the words global governance. It sounds very boring, doesn't it? But unfortunately, this boring term is actually something that is incredibly important for you to understand. And why is it important for you to understand? It's important for you, especially your generation, those of you who will be working 20 years from now. It's important for you to understand that the world has changed fundamentally. Now, what do I mean by this fundamental change? Now, I use a very simple boat analogy to capture how the world has changed fundamentally. And what I say is that in the past, we have 8 billion people on planet Earth. They live in 193 separate countries. That's why you have 193 member states in the United Nations. Now, in the past, when 8 billion people live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? So each country has its own boat. If the other boat catches fire, no problem. My boat is far away. I won't be affected by the fire. If the other boat catches COVID, no problem. I'm on a different boat. I won't catch COVID, right? But what's happened is that the world has shrunk dramatically, right? As a result of the forces of globalization, and effectively the 8 billion people of planet Earth now no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And as you know, if you're on the same boat, if a cabin on the boat catches fire, you want to put it out immediately because it can affect the rest of the boat. And if a cabin on the boat catches COVID, guess what? Every cabin gets COVID. That's what happened, right? You saw. It began maybe in a marketplace in Wuhan, and it spread around the world. Amazing. So we are on the same boat. So clearly, there has been a structural change in the global condition. We are on the same boat. But the problem we have is that the intellectual mindsets that we have to understand our world come from a different generation when countries were far apart. And I'll just give you one example. One of the concepts that countries keep emphasizing is their sovereignty. By sovereignty, they mean that I control my country, what I do with my country is my business, and you stay out of my country, right? In theory, that's right. Countries should have sovereign independence and to be able to do what they want to do. Now that's okay if you're on a separate boat. But if you're in a cabin, what you do in your cabin is affecting other cabins. So clearly the concept of sovereignty has to be modified. And what's remarkable is that this concept of sovereignty came about as a result of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. 1648. It is a 17th century concept that is still ruling the minds of people 375 years later, right, in the 21st century. Now, you would think that we have become so intelligent, so clever, that we can just take these old concepts from our pocket and just throw them away. It's not so easy. Human beings, unfortunately, even though they claim to be the most intelligent species of planet Earth, are actually not very intelligent and actually stuck with old mindsets and old concepts that continue to haunt us, even though the world has changed fundamentally. So this is the big challenge for your generation. How do you escape the clutches of 375-year-old concepts, develop new ones that are more relevant to the world that you are going to grow up in? And that, I assure you, is going to be a big challenge. Now, I haven't even mentioned the single biggest global challenge that the world is going to face. Again, I guarantee you, it's going to accelerate over the next 10 to 20 years, and that's the challenge of climate change, right? And you all know that no one country can fix or deal with climate change. Every country in the world has got to come together. All the cabins of the boat have got to come together to deal with climate change. And one would think that since climate change is about to sink the boat that we are on, and let me emphasize one point, that human beings, there are, forgive me, whatever it is, there are billions or trillions of stars in the universe, but despite the fact that billions, trillions of stars and planets in the universe, there's only one planet we can live on, planet Earth. There is no planet B we can go to. Logically, if you are on a boat and the boat is sinking and you have no other boat to go to, what do? You save the boat. That's not happening. Instead, countries are still focused on their own cabin and not on saving the boat. That's an amazing tragedy. Amazing. And all the wisdom in the world today cannot stop it. Isn't that amazing? That's why I guarantee you that 20 years from now, you will be dealing with a real challenge of global governance. Now, finally, let me come to the last G, good governance. And by good governance, I'm referring to how countries manage their own societies, how they govern them, how they develop their own people, and how they progress. And here too, it's remarkable that even though we live in a world where there are thousands more universities than there used to be. There are thousands more university-educated people. We all know how to develop and grow societies. We know the formulas. And so having done all that, you would assume that good governance should be spreading around the world. Actually, it isn't. Some countries are doing very well. Others are doing very badly. And if you don't have good governance in your society, you will suffer the consequences. Now, in case the concept of good governance seems very abstract to young people in Hong Kong, try to remember what your life was like when you had riots in the streets in 2019. I think you're old enough to remember that, right? Why did the riots happen? What was the cause of the riots? Right? In theory, of course, it had to do with unhappiness over things like the national security law. That was real. But if you look at my book, Has China Won?, I point out that there are also structural factors inside Hong Kong that drove the riots. And one of the structural factors that drove the riots is that 50% of the population didn't have access to good housing. People were unhappy. Their lives were not improving. And when people's lives don't improve, they go on riots, and you have turbulence. That's what happens when you don't have good governance. And I can tell you, what is shocking is that it is also happening in the world's wealthiest and most powerful society, in the United States of America, right? Now, believe me, the United States of America is a remarkable society. In many ways, it's still by far the most dynamic society on planet Earth in terms of its capacity to innovate, to change, to adapt, and so on and so forth. Yet, despite all that, and despite having the best universities in the world, despite having the best trained minds in government, the United States doesn't enjoy good governance. That's quite remarkable. Now, what's my proof that the United States doesn't enjoy good governance? The proof is very simple. Even though the top 10% in America have seen their lives improve dramatically over the past 3 or 4 decades, and let me give you one statistic that illustrates how well the top 10% have done. In the year 1978, right, 45 years ago, the average salary of the CEO was 30 times larger than the average salary of the worker in America. CEO, 30 times more than the worker. By 2021, 2022, the average salary of the worker, of the CEO, was 1,500 times bigger than the average salary of the worker. that dramatic surge of inequality is a result of the fact that the top 10%, top 20% saw this dramatic improvement in their standard of living, and the bottom 50% just saw stagnation or decline. And by the way, if you want the data, you'll find it in chapter 7 of my book, Has China Won? You'll find it in the works of Angus Deaton, the Nobel laureate. And this is actually quite shocking. How can the world's most advanced society allow the deterioration in living standards of 50% of its population? Right? And by the way, the result of that deterioration is that the United States is the only developed society where life expectancy is decreasing, not increasing. This doesn't happen in developed societies. In fact, even in developing societies, life expectancy has been improving significantly. So clearly, if in the most advanced and most developed society you have a shortage of good governance, you realize that getting good governance is not easy. It's not easy because you have to figure out what is the best political system for your country, and how you manage that together with a free and open economy, and how you create formulas for social redistribution of wealth to take care of people at the bottom. And by the way, paradoxically, one of the best works of philosophy of recent times that captures how you balance all these different demands is a book written by an American philosopher called A Theory of Justice. That philosopher is John Rawls. Martin, I studied him when I was in Dalhousie. It is a remarkable book. If you get a chance, please read it. It'll take you a few years. It's a very difficult book to read, but it gives the formulas for how to achieve good governance. And the key point that John Rawls emphasizes, and this is a point you must always remember 10 to 20 years from now when you're trying to achieve good governance, remember that the most just society is not the society that takes care of the top 10%. The most just society is a society that takes care of the bottom 10% and raises their standard of living. This is obvious. And clearly, societies that have done that have grown and thrived and done well. And I've had many good fortunes in my life, but one of the good fortunes in my life was to have been born in Singapore. And when I was born in Singapore, Singapore became independent in 1965, we were a poor developing country. Our per capita income was $500, the same as Ghana. And since I came from a poor family too, when I went to school, at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. Now you can see I'm overnourished. So I've traveled a long journey. When I was young, we had no flush toilet in our house. I'm telling you all this so you understand that there used to be a world where people used to struggle for some of these basic things. And amazingly, despite the fact that I was born and brought up in a poor Singapore, I ended up growing up in a Singapore that has probably seen the most spectacular increase in the standard of living. And I argued in an essay in 2015 that no society has improved the standard of living of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore did so in its first 50 years of independence. Why do I mention this? Because there are, in some cases, examples of good governance that you can learn from, right? There are examples of failures, You have to study the failures, and you also have to look for examples of good governance. And so in Singapore, for example, 90% of the population live in homes that they own. 90%. And what Singapore has done, Hong Kong can do. And if you can get 90% of the population of Hong Kong to live in homes that they own, I predict there'll be less riots in the street in Hong Kong. So therefore, this explains why you also have to deal with the challenges of good governance. So I hope I've given you a glimpse of the 3 big challenges that you will face, and I wish you great success as you navigate these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahbubani, and please be seated on the stage for the Q&A session. We have all learned so much from your insightful sharing and illuminating enlightenment on the intricacies of international relations and diplomacy.
So before we open the floor to all the students for any questions you may have, as we have the honor of being the MCs for today's event, we'd like to start the dialogue with our own questions. So I'd like to ask you, in the beginning of your speech, you talked a bit about the US and China. So how can we ensure global superpowers that currently seem to prioritize self-interest also work collaboratively on an international scale to ensure sustainable development for the world as a whole?
That's a very good question. Rationally, the United States and China, if they wanted to improve the lives of their people and improve the condition of planet Earth, they should be working together, logically. Unfortunately, world history never progresses logically or rationally. And sometimes issues of power become more important than issues of reason. So unfortunately, much as I hope, right, that the US and China will find ways and means of working together. And by the way, to be fair, I think President Joe Biden actually had a very good meeting with President Xi Jinping in Bali in November last year. And at that meeting, I think they agreed on finding ways and means of collaborating in some areas. And for a while, I thought that their relations would start improving, you know. Then unfortunately, there was an accident. A balloon drifted into American airspace. The American people got really alarmed by this balloon, and that balloon stirred up anti-China sentiment in the US. And as you know, Secretary of State Blinken had to cancel his visit to China as a follow-up to the meeting in Bali. So you have accidents like this that happen. So the problem we have is that you need exceptionally good statesmen to overcome things like this. But we don't live in a world of exceptionally good statesmen. Of course, until your generation goes into become leaders. But and so as a result of that, even though there are very powerful reasons why they should cooperate, I suspect the competition dimension. I mean, I would like to be proven wrong in my prediction, but unfortunately, I keep getting proven right.
I see. Thank you for your insights. So moving on, we'd like to open the floor for any questions students in the audience right now may have. There will also be some virtually from students that are dialing in from the mainland campuses. So please raise your hand if you have any questions for Professor Mahbubani, and a staff member will pass you a microphone.
There's a lady there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much, Kishore, for your wonderful insight. I wanted to ask about your predictions on the US dollar. So in your book, Has China Won, you mentioned about the diminishing power due to the reduced countries' incentive to reduce independence dependence on the US dollar. However, there are other countries such as Brazil, China, India, et cetera, who had plans to create another global currency. So what are your predictions on the power of the US dollar in the next 20 years? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question, but a very difficult question. You know, when you deal, I have to emphasize that when you deal with issues, especially in the financial sector, they're very complex, and it's difficult to summarize them or to try and put them down in simple terms. But nonetheless, I'll try to describe the various issues about the US dollar in very simple terms. The first point I would make is that the US dollar has been the global reserve currency, I think, for about 130 years or so, since the United States emerged as the #1 power in the world in the 1890s. And I can confidently predict that the US dollar will remain the global reserve currency for at least another 2 or 3 decades. Why do I say that? Because it's very difficult to create an alternative to the US dollar. Now, traditionally, the currency of the world's largest power, remember before US, it was United Kingdom, then the British pound was the global reserve currency, and then it went to US dollar, becoming the global reserve currency. So in the same way, when China becomes #1, right, in 10, 15 years, whenever, in theory, the renminbi should become the global reserve currency. But it will be very difficult because China doesn't allow what they call free flow of movement in the capital account. Now you'll have to go and look at your economics textbooks to find out what a capital account and so on and so forth. But anyway, at the end of the day, because of that constraint, the renminbi is not going to replace the US dollar anytime soon. And as a result of that, the United States will retain that leverage, and having the dollar as the global reserve currency gives tremendous power to the United States. So for example, I'm going to give you a very simple example. Many years ago, a French bank, and France is a friend of the United States, okay? Good friend of the United States. A French bank financed some trade between France and Iran. The United States was not involved. But because the trade between France and Iran was done through US dollars, that violated an American law. Because it violated an American law, the French bank had to pay a fine of $9 billion. The largest fine in human history. So you can see this. France and Iran didn't break any international laws, but France had to pay a fine of $9 billion to the United States. That's the power of the US dollar, okay? You can get a country like France to pay a big fine. And that's power. And I don't see that diminishing anytime soon. But at the same time, I do think, and this is a fact, the United States has been weaponizing the US dollar. Again, to explain how weaponization means, I would encourage you to go and just Google and download a few articles. By weaponizing the US dollar, more and more countries want to reduce their trade dependence on the US dollar. So for example, now Saudi Arabia is prepared to sell oil to China, and instead of getting paid in US dollars, which the Saudis used to insist on, now Saudi Arabia says, I'll accept Chinese renminbi. And then, of course, that will progressively reduce the dependence on the US dollar. But the total amount of money used in global trade is a tiny fraction of the amount of money that's used in financial transactions. And therefore, even if the role of the US dollar in global trade goes down, the role of the US dollar in global financial transactions is not going down. And therefore, the de-dollarization is not going to happen anytime soon.
Do we have any other questions?
Front.
Yeah, in the front.
Hi, Professor. Hi, Professor. I really enjoy your speech. Thank you. I want to ask that, as an advocate for improved global governance, what do you think are the most pressing challenges facing international institutions today, and how can they be addressed? Thank you.
Well, I would say that there are many challenges facing international institutions, and fortunately for me, I was able to write a book called The Great Convergence, which explains how the different international institutions face different challenges. So take a few of the leading ones: United Nations, IMF and World Bank, World Trade Organization, you can go on. They face different challenges. Now, in the case of the United Nations, and I'm a great believer in the United Nations, and if you all haven't read it, please read the Charter of the United Nations. It's one of the most beautiful documents you can read. It's a lovely document. And I think the Charter still remains relevant for the world. Now, but the paradox about the United Nations is that even though the Charter, this beautiful document, was written by Western statesmen carrying Western ideas, Western concepts, one would think, therefore, that the Western countries would be the chief defenders of the United Nations. Actually, the Western countries are undermining the United Nations. And they do it in many ways. One way they do it is through financial strangulation. All organizations need money to run on, but the money is deprived. And if you look, for example, in my book, The Great Convergence, I describe how in the 1960s and 70s, 60 to 70% of the budget of the World Health Organization will come from compulsory assessed contributions. Compulsory assessed contributions are important because you pay salaries, long-term salaries from compulsory assessed contributions. And the voluntary contributions were small, 20, 30%. Guess what? Today, the compulsory contributions to the UN have gone down from 70% to 18%. 82% comes from voluntary contributions. Voluntary contributions go up, go down. You cannot recruit people and offer them a long-term career on the basis of voluntary contributions. Because next year, if there's no voluntary contributions, how do you pay the salaries? You can only pay salaries on the basis of the compulsory assessed contributions. So the Western countries, by reducing the compulsory contributions from 70% to 18%, are strangling United Nations organizations. That's unwise. Very unwise, but that's a real challenge. So that's the challenge for the UN. Now, in the case of the IMF and the World Bank, it's a different challenge. They were again set up when the Western countries were very powerful, and there was a rule that said to become the head of the IMF, you had to be a European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. Now, that rule made sense in the 1950s, 1960s, because they were so powerful. Today, the fastest growing economies in the world are in Asia. But no Asian can qualify to run the IMF or the World Bank. Why not? I mean, surely one of you can become the head of deprived of that opportunity, right? But that voting system is rigged. Now, that's too complicated for me to explain. Again, you go and look at how, I mean, to put it very simply, China's share of the global GNP has gone up from whatever it is, 2-3% to 17 or 18% of the global GNP. Now, China's share, voting share of IMF should also go up to 16-17% of IMF, but it's only 6%. And the Europeans prevent a readjustment of voting shares. Again, that's unwise, right? And then when you come to the World Trade Organization, which is another important international institution, sadly, it is not functioning well because the United States is blocking the appointment of appellate court judges. Again, please Google and read about appellate court judges. And if you don't have appellate court judges, you cannot handle trade disputes. And if you cannot handle trade disputes, you have a problem. So again, if you read the column by Martin Wolf that I mentioned, he in that column he says it's unwise for the US to block the appointment of appellate court judges. So different international institutions have different challenges to deal with.
Thank you, Professor, for your thoughtfulness. Do we have any questions from the middle? Yeah, could we pass the mic to Venus, please?
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Professor Kishore, for your insightful talk. I have a really general question. According to your years of experience in the fields of diplomacy and politics, what do you think are some of the key skills and qualities that are essential to this, to your success in this field of diplomacy? Thank you.
Well, you know, I'm sure you're aware that on issues of leadership, historians have been studying for centuries what makes a good leader. So some years ago, I co-authored an article on what makes a good leader. It was published by Project Syndicate. You can Google and get it, in which I say that a good leader has to have 5 C's. I hope I can remember all 5. I normally forget one. So if whatever I forget, C, you can find it on Google, I guess. The first C is compassion. To become a leader, to succeed in politics, that's your question. To become a good leader, to succeed in politics, you must have compassion for the people. You must have a heart that believes that my job is to help people. And if you help people, then people will say, this man, this woman is helping me. Let me vote for this leader. First is compassion. That one no one will disagree with. The second C, lots of people disagree with me. And the second C is the English word called cunning. Because if you're not shrewd and clever, politics is a very dangerous, slippery game. It's one of the most difficult professions in the world. So if you're not cunning, you won't succeed. And there's no point in having a good heart. And somebody who doesn't have a good heart is more cunning. He gets a job, you don't get the job. So you have to be more shrewd to get the job. Make sure the person who doesn't have a heart doesn't get the job. And the third C is that you got to master complexity. Because today's world, as you know, is getting more and more complicated. So for example, if you say, I want to lead the world in the fight against climate change, I try to follow the scientific dimensions of climate change. Very difficult, very complex, right? But you got to be a master of complexity. And number 4, you got to be a collector of talent. No leader succeeds on his or her own right. You must have a great team to work with you. So the reason why, for example, why Singapore became the most successful nation in human history was because we had a very good leader, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, but he was surrounded by remarkable people. Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam, Hon Swee Sen, Toh Chin Chai, many others. So he was a real collector of talent. And that's why Mr. Lee Kuan Yew succeeded. And the 5th C, I remembered, fortunately, is courage. Because at the end of the day, to be a good leader, you must be ready to fight. Because nobody ever gives you a leadership position, say, please, come and become CEO. You have to fight for it. You have to earn it. And you have to struggle. And sometimes you have to be fight big battles, and you must have a lot of courage. So I hope that these 5 C's will enable you to succeed in the future. Thank you.
So we have a question from YCIS Beijing, and Qingdao. Can you describe a particularly challenging situation you faced in your role as a diplomat and how you overcame it?
Wow. Well, I mean, I did face many difficult challenges, but I sometimes didn't overcome them. I'll give you an example. When I was president of the UN Security Council in 2002, and I received a request as president of the UN Security Council from the head of the International Court of Justice, ICJ. And the head of the ICJ wanted to come and brief the UN Security Council on what the ICJ is doing. I said, great. The World Court wants to talk to UN Security Council. The World Court is the world's most powerful judicial body, although it doesn't have capacity to implement its decisions, but it is respected. And then you have the UN Security Council, which is by far the most powerful organization in the world, because only the UN Security Council, it's the only international institutions that can make decisions that are binding and mandatory on all 193 countries. So the UN Security Council can serve as the government of the world in some ways. So I said, great, the head of the World Court wants to come and brief wants to brief the Security Council. I saw no problem. So when the Security Council meets for informal consultations, it meets in a small room. The room is about the size of this stage, maybe smaller. And 15 of us sit around a horseshoe table and we discuss. So I said to my fellow 15, to the other 14 ambassadors, I said, good news, the president of the World Court wants to brief the UN Security Council. I hope we can welcome him. Most people said yes, all the countries said yes, but one country objected, United States. And so when the American representative said, no, we object to having a briefing by the World Court, we have issues with the World Court, I said, okay, since you have a problem, and since this is a procedural issue on whether or not we should invite the president of the World Court, I said, let's have a vote to see whether or not we should invite the president of the World Court. And the representative of the US is much smarter than me. He said, no. The question as to whether or not it's a procedural issue is a substantive issue. And therefore, United States can veto that decision. Now, when the United States brings out its veto, I have no power. So I lost. So in life, it's important for you to know that you will lose in many areas also. Get ready for failures.
Okay, so we have one last question. This one's from a history teacher, also from one of the mainland schools. And I think this question's pretty interesting. And you mentioned that you're a big believer of the UN, but they'd like to ask, structurally, the UN shares many similarities with the League of Nations in the past. So given the current issues and problems that the UN faces, are you optimistic that the UN won't go the same way as the League of Nations?
Yeah, I would say that's an excellent question, And in theory, the UN could also fail and collapse, like the League of Nations. Although now it's been around since 1945, so it's almost, it'll be 80 years old in 2 years' time. But there is one fundamental difference between the United Nations and the League of Nations. And that fundamental difference will ensure its survival. Now, as you know, the League of Nations collapsed because the United States Senate refused to ratify the agreement that President Woodrow Wilson had negotiated right? And they said, no, we will not join League of Nations. But why is the United States staying on in the United Nations? Because unlike the League of Nations, where United States had no veto power, in the United Nations, United States together with the 4 other permanent members, United States, Russia, China, UK, France, all 5 have the veto. Now the veto power is very powerful, by the way. It can stop any decision that's being made by the United Nations. Now, so the United States, therefore, wants to stay, not just United States, to be fair, United States, China, Russia, UK, France, all 5 want to stay in the United Nations because they enjoy the veto power. And if the United States, from time to time, has threatened to leave the UN, but has never done so. And indeed, the United States also, when it cuts its contributions to the UN, it never cuts to a level where it can technically fall into areas. If it technically falls into areas, the United States loses its vote, and the United States will lose its veto. And therefore, they always keep paying just to ensure that they never lose their vote. So that's the structural difference between the United Nations and the League of Nations. So I'm confident that it will be around for another 100 years.
Thank you, Professor Mahbubani. We have time for around 2 more questions on site. So does anyone want to ask anything? Could someone pass the mic to Ruben, please?
Thank you, Professor, and just say that it is an honor to hear you speak today. You spoke extensively earlier about globalization, and I liked your analogy with the boat. So I wanted to know, what are some of the greatest factors and events that have happened that have affected the human condition or the human experience as a result of our world becoming a more interconnected global village, as you say, as opposed to just a patchwork of separate and isolated states? Thank you.
Well, I would say there are many, many forces. The first, of course, is economic globalization. Economic globalization has made us much more interdependent as a global economy. And you saw that in the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. As you know, it began as a result of the collapse of Lehman Brothers in New York, but it spread to the whole world. So that was a reflection of how we are on the same boat, And you saw that also similarly with COVID. And that's a result of the disappearance of distance, right? And that the disappearance of distance is a result of scientific and technological development. So, for example, now, in the past, for most of human history, most human beings never left their country. Today, in every country in the world, people are leaving their countries and traveling. Every country, right? Sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. So they are traveling. And so that again makes the world, that again shows that we are on the same boat. And of course, in terms of human consciousness, today when you have a smartphone, you can just Google and you can find out what the weather is like in Rio de Janeiro or the weather is like in San Francisco immediately, right? We have access to information in any corner of the world, again showing how interconnected we are becoming. So there are many, many forces at play that have created this one boat that we are on. But again, as I said in my lecture, unfortunately, even though we are on the same boat, we still continue to pretend that we are on different boats. And our mindsets haven't changed, and that fundamental change of mindset only your generation can make. So I'll come back here in 20 years and ask you whether you succeeded.
We still have one more question left. Okay, yeah, the gentleman at the back, please.
Thank you, Professor Kishore. I'm Michael. Thank you very much for your sharing. My question is simple. If you could travel the time machine going back to the age of 30, how would you equip yourself again in order to tackle the challenges, as you mentioned, if a young student wants to improve himself and contribute to the human civilization like you? Thank you very much.
So let me see, where was I at the age of 30? That was the year 1978, I guess. I was then based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I was a diplomat then. And I would say in 1978, the dominant global condition was driven by the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. And everyone thought that this Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union would carry on forever when I was there in 1978. And I can tell you that no one in 1978 predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union that happened about 13 years later. So the one point I'm making here is that much as you would like to try to, be sure that some things will happen, sometimes you still get big surprises in the world. At that time, all we were focused on was on ensuring that the Cold War didn't disrupt our lives. And to some extent, we succeeded, right? We succeeded in managing the Cold War, and at the end of the day, as you know, there was no major war between the United States and Soviet Union. So in the same way, I would say, if I was 30 years old today, my main focus would be on how to prevent a war between the United States and China. Because if there is a war between the United States and China, believe me, the world will be in a terrible place. So at each epoch, you got to focus on the biggest challenge of the time. And at our time, it was a Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. Today, it's the United States and China. So that's the difference between what I was like when I was 30 and what it is like today for all of you.
Thank you, Professor. Was there one more question in the front?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Professor Kishore. I got one question. Because China defended its stance on the war in Ukraine and its close ties with Russia, and said that the U.S. should change its stance too. So how do you think that the war has affected the power relationship between China and the U.S. and other powers' attitudes towards them?
Well, very challenging question. The Ukraine war has definitely contributed to a deterioration in relations between the United States and China because the United States wants China to apply pressure on Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. Now, there's no doubt that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal under international law, right? The UN Charter explains why that invasion is illegal. And so we should all oppose it. But at the same time, while many countries oppose the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is also a fact that the 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia. And so China, in not imposing sanctions on Russia, is behaving like the rest of the 85%. And what's interesting is that if you study the position of the world's largest democracy, which is India, India's position on Ukraine is almost exactly the same as China's position on Ukraine. So they don't support the war, but they're not imposing sanctions on Russia. And in fact, India has purchased far more oil
from Russia than China has since the war began. So even though of China's position on Ukraine, in many ways China's position is no different from India's position, and of course the United States has not been critical of India's position. Now, why that is the case, you have to understand one of the oldest rules of geopolitics: there are always double standards in international relations.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you to everyone for all your thoughtful questions and for your active participation. We have all gained a great deal from this exchange.
And thank you so much for your further insights, Professor Mahbubani. Time really flies, doesn't it? We've now reached the end of our sharing session with Professor Mahbubani this morning. May you please be seated off stage again? Thank you.
May I now invite Dr. Esther Chan, Deputy CEO of the Yuchong Yiwa Education Network, K-12 Education, to share her concluding remarks.
Professor Mahbubani, as we approach the conclusion of this event, I would like to express our heartfelt appreciation for inspiring and thought-provoking sharing, as well as your enlightening exchange with our Hong Kong youth. We're honored to have student and teacher representatives from over 20 schools and colleges in Hong Kong, including the Yuchong College of Early Childhood Education, join us here today, as well as students from 8 of our mainland China Yuchong Yiwa YCYW schools watching online. As a member of the YCYW Education Network, Yuchong International School of Hong Kong is privileged to host this special occasion this morning. As an education network celebrating our 90th anniversary this year, YCYW is dedicated to nurturing future leaders who embody the values of service, contribution to society, and global perspectives. Hence, the dialogue and exchange that took place today carries significant weight and is truly inspiring for all the students who participated. Professor, your visit to Hong Kong this time has been a source of great inspiration. The luncheon yesterday also provided senior representatives from different sectors with a better understanding of the Sino-US relationship, and more importantly, how we can contribute to this essential conversation. Once again, I extend our sincere gratitude to you, Professor, for engaging in such an stimulating dialogue with us today. Thank you very, very much. I would also like to express my gratitude to everyone who participated in this event today. May I now invite you, Professor, again on stage, as well as Dr. Betty Chan, our CEO and school supervisor, onto the stage. We would like to present a souvenir to Professor as a token of our appreciation. Thank you.
Could you all remain on stage? Thank you. May I now invite Ambassador Chan, Professor Paul Yip, Mr. Paul Z, Dr. Lydia Chan, and Mr. Martin Scott onto the stage to join us for a group photo. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and we hope that you will all leave here with new insights, perspectives, and a renewed commitment to promoting peace and understanding in this world.
Before we conclude today's event, it's such a rare opportunity to have so many schools participating in this event. So we would like to take a group photo with everybody here. So when the guests are all seated, the camera team will be on stage, and you can all remain on your seats. Thank you.
Go